Hi everyone, it's Winning, it's live online with me, Debbie. As always, so looking forward to spending some time with you tonight in this, if you're living in Cape Town, in this incredible heat. I don't know how we're going to survive the rest of February. I mean, we've not even hit February yet. Just had a really productive week. I'm sure that you've kind of settled, those of you who are at work have settled into being back at work and gotten back into the routine. It's amazing how when you've been on holiday with no routine, it can sometimes be quite challenging getting back into that routine mode, but it doesn't take long. So tonight I'm looking forward to doing, it's a session called Move On, and I think it's very appropriate for the start of a year. It's often at the start of a year where we are optimistic. I don't do New Year's resolutions myself, but hopefully it's a time where you actually set new goals for yourself. But we don't want to do New Year's resolutions where by the middle of February we've forgotten about them. Winning is more than just talking about change, and tonight is more than just thinking about change. Tonight is about actually changing. Hey Zama, good to see you. And so, hey King and Queen, good to see you both. And so tonight, looking at moving on, it's quite challenging. Hey Trace, I felt really challenged in myself, as always, in putting the presentation together. Sorry, the lighting may be a bit different. My phone, I think, is eventually just going to phone heaven. So I'm actually working off of my iPad. And so the lighting's a little bit different. Even I look a little bit different. I'm a bit bigger than what I am normally. But tonight is looking at actual change, not virtual change. Actual moving on, not virtual moving on. So as always, if anything kind of you identify it with, just give me some kind of emoji, and as always, just share. There's always someone besides you that could benefit from tonight's message. And remember, we're all about church beyond these walls. So at Authentic City Church, our mandate for the next 5 years is to lift lives, connect people to Jesus, and just move beyond the walls of the church. And so, are you ready for tonight? Are you focused? Have you put aside that you are incredibly hot? Have you put aside the busyness of the day, and it's like you're leaning in and you're focused on what's going to happen tonight? Hey, Ronnie, good to see you. And so I want to just kick off. I love it when the Lord kind of downloads something that really challenges you. And he did that for me this week. And that was the whole thing about pushing past your threshold. We all have thresholds. I mean, we have a pain threshold. It's like when you reach that level where you think, I can't take any more. But then you kind of just push past that limit. And then you go into the realm of more, because we need to push past thresholds. Otherwise, we'll never know what we're capable of. I mean, some people have a patience threshold, and then the Lord gives you children. And then you push past that threshold that you had with patience into a whole new realm of patience. And so I think the bottom line for me is if we don't push past those thresholds, we'll never know and never step into the capacity that God has for us, because God's capacity, and I've said it before, goes beyond what we can accomplish in the natural. It's where we step into the supernatural. It's where you look at, how did I do this? Wow, God's really given me grace for this. And I want to sort of just bring that element in. I mentioned, I think 2 weeks ago, about, there's a universal church theme. And it rests on the premise of grace and truth. So grace isn't just God's unconditional love, mercy, and blessing on us. Grace is also its equipping. Because remember, grace isn't a concept. Grace is Jesus. Jesus is grace. So yes, it's unconditional love and undeserved favor, but there's another very powerful side to grace. And that's the equipping element of grace. God's grace equips us to push past what we think is the unpushable past limit of who we are as people. But it takes a decision where I don't want to be limited by a threshold. Lord, together with you giving me the equipping grace, I want to move past my safe zone. Those of you who attend a city church and were at church on Sunday, you would have heard me use that statement. So it's pushing beyond our safe zone. And I think tonight is part of that. Looking at the fact that God has created us with so much capacity. Last week we looked at the capacity that God gives us to love on another level, to love on the level that he loves. But if we don't push past the threshold of our natural capacity and capability, we're not going to experience his empowering and his equipping for us to live life his way. And so tonight I really want to challenge you to step out of what's safe, to allow God's equipping grace to equip you. And you know what? God doesn't move the trials, but what he does do is as we move through trials, by crossing thresholds, by allowing his equipping grace to equip us, our hearts get softer and our skin gets thicker. What does that mean? Well, basically it means that your capacity to openness to God as you cross your threshold, your openness to God increases. Your ability to love as he loves increases. Your ability to forgive unconditional increases. Your capacity to not be offended diminishes. And your ability to extend grace and forgiveness increases. But it also allows our skin to get thicker. And so if you think of a callus, a callus will develop where there's been constant pressure. Some people get calluses on their feet, on their hands, where you've constantly been applying pressure through hard work. And initially where there's a pressure point, you'll get blister after blister after blister. But when the pressure keeps on that same spot, the skin eventually becomes thickened and hardened and able to endure the tough. So when we cross the threshold, we step into where we rely on his equipping and enabling and empowering grace. And our skin, our spiritual skin, our emotional skin gets thicker as we increase our capacity to endure more and more in the victory of what he's called us to live in. So kind of just keep that principle, keep that concept on the one side of your thinking as we do tonight. I want to start off with a very simple basic law. And the law is as follows. If you want to move from here to there, you have to actually step out of where you are, move, and step into where you want to be. It's just an amazing law. It's like stepping out of to step into. And, if you think, so often we will want to grow in an area in our lives and we verbalize it. We'll say, my goal is to lose weight. My goal is to get fit. My goal is to be more open-handed and open-hearted. But we don't actually take the first step. We kind of speak it and then we get comfortable. Well, at least I've spoken it. But we're actually not moving on. We're actually still in the same space. And winning is all about moving on. Winning is all about moving forward. Winning is all about growing. Sometimes we can verbalize moving on, but our language and our behavior and our attitude show more signs of residual hurt and unresolved issues than what we do showing advancement and movement. So what do I mean by that? Here's a classic example. Moving on from a broken relationship. It's like I've moved on from that relationship, whether it be romantic or otherwise. I've closed that door. Awesome. You've spoken about moving on. But then your actions is, why are you continually scrolling through Instagram and Facebook of past relationship, of seeing what your friend, partner is still doing with their lives. So you're speaking moving on, but your actions show residual hurt and maybe unresolved issues. Let's get away from that. Let's speak and do and be and grow. And it takes actually moving on, because otherwise we're living in a kind of virtual reality of stuff where we speak, but we're not actually living in it in reality. I don't know about you. I don't want virtual peace. I want the peace that God has for me, which means actually actioning what I speak over my life. You know, in Genesis 19, there's the story of Lot's wife. And Lot was Abraham's nephew, and they lived in Sodom and Gomorrah, and God moved in and said, I'm going to wipe this place out. It's so evil. And so Lot and his wife and his family pack their bags and they move. But Lot's wife, as they're moving out and as Sodom and Gomorrah is destroyed, for one moment she looks back, which is indicative that her actions show that she had a residual attachment to Sodom and Gomorrah. And as she looks back, she's turned into a pillar of salt. So she didn't actually cut her attachment. She may have moved on, but in her thinking and in her heart, she was still attached to where God had said, move away from. And that not moving on, it cost her everything. And so often not moving on can cost us so much if we don't move on from a bitterness around something that has happened. If we don't move on in terms of growth in the area of extending unconditional forgiveness to others, it can cost us so much. And so moving on is a really powerful message tonight about you releasing you into your next. We can't blame God if we're not growing. He's done everything for us. Jesus died on the cross for our sins so that we could have a relationship with God and be set free from sin, Satan, and death. God has given us equipping grace to empower us to move past those limiting thresholds and live in another realm. You know, God's laid it all on the table. But if we're living in virtual reality and just talking about change, well, then we only have ourselves to blame. But so often God gets blames for it. So true movement, true moving on is when we embrace the future. And if you embrace something, you're wrapping your arms around it. And where you forgive what's past. And when I say past, it's the good, the bad, and the ugly. I think it's always important looking at the past is that what we've loved, what we've learned, what we've lost, what we've gained in the past often needs to come with us by way of lessons, by way of impartation of wisdom. That needs to come with us, but not the constant memory of, the constant being attached to toxic behavior, toxic people, toxic perspectives. We need to actually move out so that we move on, so that we step into. You know, in 1 Chronicles 13, David is returning the Ark of the Covenant to Jerusalem, and his intentions were good, but he didn't receive directive from God. And so as the Ark is on the cart being pulled by an animal, the animal trips and stumbles, and as a result, the cart becomes unstable. And Uzzah puts his hand out to settle and to steady the ark. And as he does that, he loses his life, which may seem, wow, that's radical. But the principle is powerful. He touched what he wasn't supposed to touch. And sometimes we're connected to things that we shouldn't be connected to. I spoke a couple of weeks ago about being Christian-ish, which is a version of Christianity. We're not supposed to be touching compromise and touching, you know, where we neither in nor out when it comes to living the life that God's called us to live. Or maybe there's a practice in our lives that's causing compromise, that is resulting in a diluted walk with God. Sometimes we're touching what we're not meant to touch, and it can cause great damage and great harm. David was initially very angry with God around this issue, but he had to learn from his mistake, repent from his anger, in order for the ark to be moved back to Jerusalem at the right time, which happens in 1 Chronicles 15. This time, David consults with God. How do I do this? When do I do it? And so the ark was moved with God's blessing. But David had to move on internally from being angry at God. So as he moved his mindset from being angry to being submissive and surrendering to God, he was able to move on physically, in his thinking, and he was able to step into what God had for him. I think, immaturity makes a lot of noise, but little progress. If you look at children, children will think of a child sitting in their car seat, and they're strapped in and they want out. So they throw a temper tantrum. So it's screaming and crying. But does that help them get out of the car seat? No, they're making a lot of noise, but there's no progress. And sometimes we can teach and preach and comment on change, but we never actually move out of the car seat of confinement. And so we're never actually changing. We're just talking about it. So if you think of a child in the car seat, if the child just reached their arms up to their caregiver, the caregiver would see, oh, we need help. Let me move in. Let me unlock that seatbelt and let them out of their car seat. And who do we lift our arms up to? We lift our arms up to the Lord. It's like, Lord, I want to move on in every sense of the word. I don't want to live in a virtual reality of progress. I want to actually live in it. And sometimes we need someone in our life to maybe say, you know what? Stop whining. Stop complaining. Stop being negative. Stop being selfish. Stop being critical. We need those kinds of friends in our lives who will actually speak the truth. And it's like, I've never had it happen to me before, but in the movies, you often see if someone wants to wake someone up, they throw a glass of ice cold water in their face. Sometimes we need that kind of reality check so that we can step up and move on. Listen to the voices the voices that call out of us, than what they do feed the space in. What do I mean by that? I don't know if you've experienced in your life, but if you start maybe gossiping, or not you, someone else gossips about a person, and they're complaining about this person's behavior. It's amazing how everyone else will say, yes, I've also had that experience with this person, and yes, I agree with you, and yes, what they did to you was so mean and so bad. And that kind of conversation's not helping you move on. What it's doing, it's not calling anything out of us. What it's doing is it's actually keeping us locked into the space we're in, because it's almost feeding it and allowing the offense, whatever the issue is, to grow and grow. We need to listen to the voices that actually challenge us and say, you know what, you're out of line. This is what I feel God is saying to you. If we want out of the car seat, then we need to have behavior that reflects our growth instead of confining us to our space. What confines us to our space? I've mentioned them throughout tonight: negativity, ingratitude, criticism, unforgiveness. So, as we land tonight, here's a powerful question. What can you, by God's empowering grace, push past in terms of pushing past your threshold, letting go and moving on? What is your challenge? Where do you feel you need to move on? Maybe it's a moving on in your perspective of faith. Maybe it's moving on in the area of generosity. Maybe it's moving on in terms of a toxic relationship, a bad habit. We all need to move on from something. We're in a constant process of being changed, in becoming more and more like Jesus. That'll never end until we get to heaven. So what do you need to move on from? Maybe just pick one thing. What's the threshold that's preventing you? Threshold could be procrastination, love of comfort, fear of the unknown. Those things can keep us locked in, not moving on. They can keep us locked into that car seat of life. So instead of talking about moving on, what's the first thing you need to do to move on? Maybe it's a thinking. Maybe it's a inner narrative. Unhook yourself from that and replace it with something else. For example, maybe an inner narrative favorite of yours is, this is too much for me. I can't do this. Unhook from that and replace it with the truth that says in Philippians 4, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. That's your first step in actually moving on. Unhook your life from a behavior that's pulling you backwards. And if necessary, admit that you were wrong. I shared last week that I said to the Lord at the beginning of the year, I want to be able to love more. I want to love more the way that you love and not my version of what I think love is. And we looked long and hard at that last week. And so step one for me was where God pushed and is pushing me past my known familiar threshold of patience. And my patience is being challenged so that I can't rely on my own natural capacity for patience. I've chosen to move past the threshold of me and into the threshold of Him regarding His providing grace for me to extend patience beyond my natural ability. What's your moving on step one? And so I really challenge you to stop living in the virtual world of spoken change, but yet behavior shows link to residual and stuff that we should have moved on from long ago. We all hurt. We all need a process to recover and work through. And sometimes we'll never get over things, but we need to get around things. But there has to be a moving on. If a child remains in that car seat, it's going to be a big problem. We need to move in Him. But in order to do that, we need to move on and push past those thresholds. I hope that you've been positively challenged. Nothing's impossible. When you're at the start of climbing a mountain and you look up at the mountain, it always looks super high and super impossible. But once you start climbing it and you realize, I can do this. You can, because you can do all things through Christ who strengthens you. Move on. Move on. And so I hope that something has landed with you in terms of application. And let's live our lives where, we might be making mistakes and getting it wrong, but at least we're moving in a moving on forward trajectory and not stuck and stationary. My prayer for you this week is that you have a powerful week, that you live working on you so that you are a better version of reflecting Him to others. Because at the end of the day, our lives are all about connecting people to Jesus and lifting lives. Go and lift lives this week. God bless you. Lots of love. Take care. Same time, same place, same person next week. Bye, everyone.